And another thing to consider is that when he went to Israel, he went to Bethel. And Bethel, or Bethel, however you want to pronounce it, means the house of God. Beth means house, and El at the end of that name means God. So Bethel literally means the house of God. So it's interesting to consider that in the house of God in Bethel, there was this man and all these other people who were following him, performing these sacrifices that were abominable to God in the house of God. And therefore we can say that this passage is spiritually talking about the church. It is talking about that place which has the name house of God in front of it at the top, but is actually doing things that are unpleasant, that are not pleasing to the Lord. And Jeroboam, the king, represents the ministers who minister in the house of God and who are supposedly doing the work of God, but who are doing other things that are not pleasant to him. And obviously, this unpleasantness, the unpleasantness of what Jeroboam was doing, was not obvious to the people who were following him. Otherwise, they would have all stepped back and said, no, we are not going to have anything to do with this. You're on your own, king. If you want to perform these sacrifices, if you want to do things like this, do it by yourself. No, they followed him. And it's also worth noting that this man was raised by God. God raised this man to become the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, just as practically all, maybe not all, but most, practically all the ministers that you see operating in the traditional church structures. They are men and women who have been raised by God in a sense. They have an endowment. They have a spiritual attribute that was given by to them by God. And they are operating in that attribute. So they're not false prophets. They're not false ministers. They're not self-proclaimed men of God. I mean, they are people who have a calling, a ministerial appointment from the Lord. The problem is they are not using it the way God intended for them to use it. So now another thing that we have to notice here is that the people here were not committing atrocities in the sense of they were not stealing, they were not, as far as I know, they were not killing anybody, at least in this passage. They were not planning a corrupt political activity. All they were doing was performing sacrifices. In other words, they were performing religious activities. And in the midst of those religious activities, you could think that they were doing things that were pleasing to God, but in fact they were doing things that God was so displeased with that he sent this man of God all the way from Judah, and there was no train, no subway that he could take. He had to walk or go afoot all the way from Judah to Bethel to confront these people. And God sent him all the way over there because he was displeased. This was a supposed house of God where religious activities were being performed by a man who was raised by God to perform activities. Yet all of that which was happening there was not pleasant to God. Now, another thing that we have to notice here is that he mentions a person who will come and overthrow all the things that Jeroboam was doing. He mentions a man called Josiah. He says, "Behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name, and he shall sacrifice on you the priests of the high places who make offerings on you, and human bones shall be burned on you." Now, Josiah in Hebrew comes from two words. It comes from Jehovah, and it also comes from another word which means to buttress or to support. So in a sense, the word Josiah means he who is supported by Jehovah. In other words, Josiah represents the remnant of God who are not supported by man, but they are supported by the Spirit of God. They have God's support, even though they may not have man's support at least at the beginning. And this is a prophetic word of how the remnant shall be raised, a spiritual remnant of believers who will overthrow the ministerial system that has kept the church in bondage for millennia, for centuries on end. And God will raise a people who will manifest the priesthood of Melchizedek, who will enable the priesthood of their brethren, instead of establishing this constant separation of ministers and laymen that the church keeps operating under. So that is what Josiah represents. He's a figure of the remnant, of the believers who will operate in the spirit and not the soul, who will operate in the priesthood of Melchizedek and not the priesthood of Aaron, which is the priesthood that the church is currently under. Even though they may deny it, that is exactly what is going on. So now the sacrifice here that he's talking about and the altar all have a message behind it. Notice that the sign that God was going to give to prove that this was word from him was, first of all, that the altar would be torn down. It says, and he gave a sign the same day, saying, "This is the sign that the Lord has spoken. Behold, the altar shall be torn down, and the ashes," number 2, "that are on it shall be poured out." Now, the altar represents something visible. And in the context of what we've been studying so far, it represents the body. Remember that, as we've said, and that's what Scripture declares, that the human being is made up of 3 components: the body, the soul, and the spirit. Those are 3 components that form a whole man. Now, the body is the visible part of the human being, what you can see on the outside, what you can touch. The soul and the spirit are invisible. Now, the altar represents that visible part of the religious activity. It's what you can see. The altar is there. You can touch it. Now, the sacrifices, the ashes that are sacrificed here, represent the soul. Why? Because it talks about the ashes being poured out. As we've studied before, the soul is spoken of in the context of it being poured out constantly throughout Scripture. And the Spirit is also poured out. But we saw that when the Spirit is poured out, there is a release of strength and victory. And when the soul is poured out, it's a manifestation of defeat and death. In this context, obviously, the pouring of the ashes of the sacrifices is not in the context of victory. It will not release an outpouring of victory and life. It's indicative of death. It's taking those ashes, those sacrifices being made on the altar, and having them poured down in defeat, as if they were worthless. So in that context, the sacrifices, the ashes that are being poured out, represent the soul.